Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Solana. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Link is in the description below. The sale will end at the end of the month. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, I don't think I've ever done a dedicated video on Solana before. I've spoken a lot about it before because I've done live streams where I spoke about Solana. I've done altcoin videos in general where I spoke about Solana, but I wanted to do a video just on Solana, mostly because I keep getting a lot of questions about it, and for good reason, right? I mean, if you go over to CoinMarketCap, you'll see that it's number 5 by market cap, and if you exclude stablecoins, it's actually number 4, right? You have Bitcoin, Ethereum, Tether, BNB, and then Solana. So it does warrant discussion, right? It does warrant discussion. It is at a market cap of 71 billion. Now, my objective in this video is to just provide, hopefully, an unbiased view. In reality, it's hard to do that, okay? And before I get into this, I want to talk about where I was right about it in the past, where I was wrong about it in the past. That way, we're all on the same page. And, you're not under the illusion that I'm always right about it or always wrong about it, right? My view back in early 2022 was, and I said this specifically, that it was time to get out of altcoins in early 2022. Because in bear market years, they tend to bleed a lot, not only on their USD pairs, but also on their Bitcoin pairs. And one of the things I said over and over again was just because an alt is down 80% does not mean it can't drop another 80%. And you can see that Solana did. Between November and May, it dropped 80%. And then from May until the end of the year, it dropped another 84%. So in a future cycle, when I say that, right, when I say just because an alt's dropped 80% doesn't mean it can't drop another 80, you know what I'm talking about, because Solana was one of the ones that did the best last cycle back in 2020. From these lows right here, it rallied 52,000%, right? 52,000%. So, saying an alt can drop 80% and then drop another 80%, it's not like a knock on the altcoin, right? Like, that's just what altcoins do. It's not, I mean, even Ethereum, which also went on to go put in new all-time highs, also dropped 80% in its first cycle and then dropped like another 75% after that. So again, just because we acknowledge that stuff can happen isn't like a knock against it. It's just that when you go through crazy bull markets with, a ton of money printing and low interest rates, it's natural for this stuff to happen. Now, I specifically said back then in 2022 that Solana could easily go sub $10. And I was right. And I sort of look back and I'm like, wow, it actually did happen. And I think a lot of the naysayers who said it wouldn't happen ended up being the ones who capitulated down here at the lows. However, I did not pivot, right? I was wrong, right? I mean, like, I was right about this, but I wasn't anticipating it to rally this much, okay? And I have no problem saying I was wrong. Yes, technically, I was right about this, but I mean, again, there's nothing really waiting for you at the end of being right unless you take action on it. And I didn't, you know? And so then it sort of had this face melting rally, essentially where it went back up. And so one of the reasons, and again, I mean, a lot of this is just a learning experience for me, and I'm trying to communicate that. One of the reasons why I was so stubborn about this was because I follow Bitcoin dominance quite closely. Okay. And my view back in 2022, right? My view back in 2022 was that Bitcoin dominance over the next several years would go from 38% to 60%. Okay. That was my view. Now, I said back then that some altcoins would outperform Bitcoin, but I didn't know which ones those were going to be. So I will just stick with Bitcoin. I said it many times. The receipts are there, right? I said Bitcoin only crypto portfolio for me until Bitcoin dominance is at 60%, which likely doesn't occur until after looser monetary policy arrives. Well, Bitcoin dominance is now almost at 58%, And guess what? Looser monetary policy is likely about to arrive. So all these years later, I can look back and say, this view wasn't really wrong, right? I mean, I was right about Bitcoin dominance. But when Solana was bottoming here on its USD pair in December 2022, I was looking at Bitcoin dominance and being like, look, it's still at 39%. It needs, in my opinion, it needs to go to 60%. And I don't know which altcoins are going to outperform it, to outperform Bitcoin. Last cycle, I ran that race. Right? I ran that race. And what I did back then was I picked out altcoins that were doing well on their Bitcoin pairs. One of the ones last cycle that I followed quite closely was Chainlink on its Bitcoin pair because it was doing very well. And also, by the way, it was actually continuing to put in new all-time highs on its Bitcoin pair. One of the frustrating things when it comes to altcoins, especially throughout bear market years and pre-halving years and halving years, is that viewers expect, people like me to time everything perfectly, right? And yes, I was right here. The naysayers capitulate down here, and then it rallies back up here, and then they say, you're wrong. And to some degree, I was, right? I did not actually pivot my view. With that said, when I talk about some alts will outperform Bitcoin and put in new all-time highs, even in, pre-halving years and halving years, at this point, Solana isn't even one of them. As much as it's done so well. I'm not trying to knock it, right? I mean, it's done so well over the last couple of years. It's up 500% on its Bitcoin pair. But when I think about it, I'm like, and I'm not saying it can't go to new all-time highs on its Bitcoin pair. It hasn't done that yet, right? So for someone like me who converted alts to Bitcoin back over here, and then I see it down here, I'm like, this was a case of the sole Bitcoin valuation going down, 89, 90%, and then rallying back up, but it's still at this point a lower high. It doesn't mean it can't put in a higher high, but there is something you have to remember. Most altcoins are oscillators at best. Not all. There are some alts that have gone on to put in new all-time highs against Bitcoin, right? From one cycle to another. It is possible for it to happen. In fact, it's happened before for altcoins, right? I mean, if you go look at some of the others in the top 10, right? I mean, if you go look at some of the ones up here, BNB, Dogecoin, right? I think both of those have been able to, at some point in prior cycles, to put in a high against their Bitcoin pair in one cycle, and then to put in a higher high in a future cycle. But collectively, right? When we're talking collectively, the altcoin market does not put in higher highs on its Bitcoin pair, right? It puts in lower highs. And you can see that when you look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, you'll see lower highs and you'll see lower lows. So that's why I say alts are oscillators at best. Now, remember, back in 2022, a lot of the alts that people were interested in were not just Solana, right? They were interested in BNB and XRP and Doge and Tron and, Toncoin and Cardano and Avalanche and, the list goes on and on. Polkadot, right? Chainlink. A lot of these have gotten destroyed, absolutely destroyed on their Bitcoin pairs. For instance, take a look at some of them. For instance, like, let's just go down the list. Let me go to their Bitcoin pairs. ETH Bitcoin. It's never stopped putting in lower lows, right? I mean, this entire cycle, I think it's probably getting close to a bottom, but it's never actually stopped going lower. Theta Bitcoin, right? I mean, look at the chart. It never really made that move. Dot Bitcoin keeps on putting in new lows. Link Bitcoin just put in new cycle lows a couple of weeks ago, right? Litecoin Bitcoin, what it does best is put in new lows. ADA Bitcoin, was just putting in new lows not that long ago. Matic Bitcoin also was putting in new lows not that long ago. So when I talk about how Bitcoin dominance will go from 38% to 60% and that some alts outperform, now you know what I'm talking about, right? Now you know, because you saw all these alts that got destroyed. And yes, there are some that did well, But what's interesting is that Solana, which has done well, still actually hasn't taken out its highs from 2021. So, technically speaking, anyone up here who made that conversion, even if you didn't pivot back over here, you're still okay, right? You're still okay. But I really want to dive into this more because, and I don't really consider it to be a mistake, honestly. It was something I said that some alts would outperform. When Sol Bitcoin was here in December of 2022, Bitcoin dominance was still down here. Now, remember, my loudest critics have been bearish on Bitcoin dominance for the last 3 years, right? Bearish on dominance. But they've been wrong. But because Bitcoin went up, which for me, Bitcoin heavy crypto portfolio until 60%, because Bitcoin went up, their altcoin was lifted up with it. So while technically I was right about dominance, their alts did okay. So, it was easy to sort of make fun. So then where is Solana today? Right? Where is Solana today? On its USD pair, it's slightly above its bull market support band. One of the issues I have right now is that it actually hasn't put in new highs. A lot of times, the newer altcoins, the lower market cap coins that I'm not really going to talk about on this channel, they're usually putting in new highs throughout, Bitcoin's quantitative tightening and high interest rate rally, right? I mean, last cycle, Chainlink was one of them. It was putting in new highs. And it wasn't the only one. Solana has not yet. It doesn't mean it won't, but it hasn't. And one thing that I sometimes think about with regards to the Sol Bitcoin pair, and again, the reason I'm making this video is just to provide another perspective. I imagine most people that talk about Solana say the same thing, and they've said the same thing for years, and they've been right for some of those years, and then wrong for some of those years. But if you're just looking at it from trying to a fresh perspective, right? What could be happening, right? What could be happening? One possibility is that it does go to new all-time highs on its Bitcoin pair. That is one possibility, okay? In fact, on its ETH pair, it already has. See this wedge? It already has gone to new all-time highs on its ETH pair. So it is a possibility. Are there other possibilities? There are. The oscillator status primarily relates to Bitcoin, right? Alts are oscillators against Bitcoin at best. At this point, Solana has not taken out these highs. There is a non-negligible chance that it could. But what does this look like? We've seen this pattern before. Doesn't mean it has to play out the same way, but we have seen it. And it's the ETH Bitcoin pattern. You'll see, in fact, that over here, ETH Bitcoin in the 2018 bear market from the high dropped 89%. Now look at Sol Bitcoin. How far did it drop? 89%. So we've seen this before in the market, right? We saw we saw ETH Bitcoin drop 89%. And then it rallied 500%. What did Sol Bitcoin do after it dropped 89%? Rallied about 500%. Kind of seems similar, right? I mean, I'm not saying it has to be exact, but there are unmistakable similarities. What did ETH Bitcoin do next after that rally? If you look, you'll see that ETH Bitcoin went through this sort of distribution phase where you had 4 peaks, and the last peak was just above the bull market support band, and it held it for about a month or two. And you see how it was always lower highs, right? It was never a higher high. It was always a lower high. And I tried convincing the ETH maxis that ETH Bitcoin was going to bleed. And to be honest, I felt more sure about that back then than the view that I'm expressing right now about Sol Bitcoin. The reason I felt more sure back then about ETH Bitcoin was because I saw tighter monetary policy coming. This time I see looser monetary policy coming. But do you see what ETH Bitcoin did after this fourth top? It sold off. And then it came right back up. So look at Sol Bitcoin. You have 4 tops. And right now, we're right above that 20-week SMA, potentially in that 4th top. I've wondered, is it possible that Sol Bitcoin does something like this, where it comes back down, but then it bounces back up? Kind of like ETH Bitcoin in 2022. You see that? You see how it sold off aggressively, and then it bounced right when, a lot of people thought it was done. And then it still eventually faded. What's interesting is that, if you look at ETH USD, we know ETH USD did go on to put in new all-time highs, right? That 500% rally by ETH Bitcoin back over here in 2019, 2020, that 500% rally, it was a great rally, right? And ETH USD technically eventually went to new highs. So it's possible, right? I mean, it's certainly possible that Solana could do something similar. But there's also this reality of, this comparison for ETH, right? Where it's falling back into the wedge as tighter monetary policy arrives, right? Remember this comparison with US interest rates? And we talked about how as rates go up, right, the Fed pause, and then the wedge starts, and then ETH USD goes out of the wedge just before the Fed cuts, and then as the cuts arrive, goes back into the wedge. See that? And you can see how it's happening again here too, right? As the Fed's about to cut, ETH USD is falling back into the wedge that it's formed. See? Low, high, higher low, higher high, higher low, break out of the wedge, then back down to the wedge. It's the same thing, right? Low, a high, a higher low, higher high, higher low, and then break out of the wedge as looser monetary policy is about to arrive, and then come back down to it as it actually does arrive. You see that? So I'm thinking, how can, what would have to happen for the Sol Bitcoin pair to sell off and then potentially just rally right back up, right? What would have to happen? What if it's the reason why the Fed's pivoting? One of the interesting things about Sol USD is that you could argue that it's a more volatile version of Ethereum. What do I mean by that? Well, this pattern we just outlined here for ETH USD, these wedges that ETH USD sort of goes up into as rate hikes are sort of finalizing and we enter into the pause. You see that? Now look at Solana. Same thing. Overlay interest rates, higher lows, also forming a wedge. You see? It's actually very similar. The difference with the wedge that Solana created there and what Ethereum created was that Solana was a more volatile version of it, right? A much more volatile version of it. You could argue the reason why it was more volatile was because it already sold off so aggressively, right? A 97% drop, whereas Ethereum only dropped 81%. So Solana dropped 97 and then rallied 2,500%. Ethereum dropped 81 and rallied 400%. So you could make the claim that in bear markets, Solana gets hit worse, as you can see, and in bull markets, it goes up more because it's further out on the risk curve. But then I'm wondering, well, what if, like, how can it go, to how could it, is there a visible path, a viable path that could cause Sol Bitcoin to come down and then bounce, right? Is there a viable path? And I wonder if it's that, right, where it does what Ethereum did, where it falls back into the wedge, right? Like, what if it falls back down here into the wedge just when everyone is thinking that the coast is clear? And I don't know if that's what's going to happen. I don't. But you can imagine that if it did fall back into the wedge, then the Sol Bitcoin pair would get a pretty large correction. What could cause this stuff, right? I mean, is this just me coping with having been on the right side of it at one point and then not pivoting? It's possible. As much as I wish that I could try to provide an unbiased view of this stuff, we're all human, and it's possible that it's a biased view. And in fact, it is, right? It is a biased view. Because if I felt very strongly about it back over here, I would have pivoted, but I was more so focused on dominance. And if dominance is at 38%, for me, historically, that's not the time to buy altcoins, right? At 38%, it's the time to basically just keep your portfolio Bitcoin heavy in preparation for a Bitcoin dominance rally. I think a lot of this stems from whether you value your portfolio in US dollars or Satoshis. And that, I think, explains the difference between how a lot of people think in the cryptoverse. Now, one interesting thing about Solana here is that, again, on its Bitcoin pair, if I say it's an oscillator at best, is it possible for it to just come back up to 47,000 sats eventually? Absolutely. It's possible, right? We have seen some altcoins do that, right? And to just pull up a couple, even Doge Bitcoin is one that, was able to eventually put in new all-time highs. BNB Bitcoin was one that eventually went on to put in new all-time highs. So it is possible, right? I'm sincerely not saying it can't happen. And back when I said that we were going to go into a Bitcoin dominance rally and that some alts would outperform, I sincerely meant that, right? I wasn't just saying it to sort of cover all my bases. I was saying it because I believed it. There are always some altcoins that outperform Bitcoin, even during the quantitative tightening, high interest rate Bitcoin dominance rally. So it is possible. But there's one element being left out of the Sol Bitcoin pair. And it's the same thing that a lot of people leave out of everything, right? And that's the fact that there's a supply component to this stuff, right? Why do so many people only look at price valuations when really we should be looking at market cap valuations? So instead of looking at the price of Solana divided by the price of Bitcoin, what if we look at the market cap of Solana divided by the market cap of Bitcoin? And if you do that, you actually see a different perspective. This might be why Solana hasn't really been able to go anywhere on its Bitcoin pair in recent months. Because the level that it's at, and it's been at essentially since 2024 began, around 0.06 to 0.07, so 6 to 7% of Bitcoin's market cap, that was actually where it topped out at in 2021. Now, I'm not suggesting it can't go above it, right? I'm really not. But it's possible to imagine a scenario where before it has a realistic chance of breaking out of that, maybe it comes down here first. What could cause that, right? What could cause that? I think a lot of people, laugh at sort of the macro stuff, right? But it was the macro stuff that told us Bitcoin dominance was going to go up for the last 3 years. Tighter monetary policy. There's one thing that still theoretically needs to happen, the timing of which is essentially impossible. But that one thing in the macroverse is the fact that we've had an inverted yield curve for over 2 years. And when you look at inverted yield curves, essentially the long end of the yield curve is lower than the short end, which doesn't make sense. Imagine if you're locking up a crypto token. Imagine if I'm trying to say it so that, a lot of people can sort of relate. Imagine you lock your crypto token up for 1 month. You would expect a lower yield than if you lock it up for 10 years, would you not? If you could get a higher yield for locking it up for 1 month, annualized, than for locking it up for 10 years, why would you want to lock it up for 10 years? Right? You'd probably want to lock it up for a shorter period of time because it's a higher yield. Now, there are reasons you might want to lock it up for a longer period of time if you think the longer yield curve is going to go down and you just want to lock in future yield as well. But if you're going to go lock up a token in the crypto space, you would expect a higher yield the longer you lock it up. And in fact, there are plenty of altcoins that follow that mechanism, right? Where you get a larger yield the longer you're willing to lock up that altcoin. But in this case, as it relates to US Treasuries, you can get, in T-bills and CDs, you can get a higher yield for shorter term treasuries than longer term treasuries. Why is that an issue? Well, if you look at treasury yield spreads, historically, inversions precede recessions. Historically. Now, the 3-month and the 10-year is still pretty far away from inverting, and I have no clue when it's going to uninvert. It inverted in October of 2022. It's almost been 2 full years. If you look at the inversion of the 2-year and the 10-year yield, they have almost uninverted. They're only, 9 basis points away from uninverting. Also, historically preceding recessions. Now, what's interesting is when you go look at the unemployment rate, a lot of people will make comparisons to 1998 and or the mid 1990s and 1967 when we had soft landings. But one of the issues with the 1967 comparison is that the unemployment rate really never durably broke out here, right, in 1967 when we had an inverted yield curve. The unemployment rate never entered the nonlinear path. It entered the nonlinear path in 1970. And in the 1990s, the mid-1990s, when we had an inverted yield curve that ended up being a soft landing, it was only a very brief inverted yield curve, and you can see the unemployment rate was always going down. So for me, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to make the 1998 or 1967 comparison, or the mid-1990 comparison, or the 1967 comparison, because the unemployment rate never entered the nonlinear zone. But in this cycle, it already has. So what if for Solana, you get a drop in the Sol Bitcoin valuation around the time that the yield curve uninverts? Do you guys remember at the beginning of August when we had a pretty big sell-off by altcoins? The yield curve almost uninverted. So this is what happened. This is what happened when the yield curve almost uninverted. It pretty quickly sold off. What happens when it actually uninverts? No. If you look at ETH Bitcoin back in 2021 and 2022, you'll see that it was putting in higher lows as well. It didn't look bad. It was higher lows. You see that? It was higher lows. But eventually it broke and it came down and then it rallied right back up. And then eventually it slowly bled. But if the Sol Bitcoin pair is repeating something remotely similar, just because it's putting in higher lows doesn't mean it's also immune to something like that. So you could get a scenario where the yield curve uninverts, Solana gets a drop back to the trend line, but instead of holding it, it drops lower, and then the money printers come back on, and then perhaps it goes right back up. Kind of like ETH Bitcoin did in 2022. What about ETH? What about Sol ETH? Sol ETH theoretically, I mean, not theoretically, I mean, it already took out the 2021 high on this wick. And now it's starting to go back up again. It's starting to go back above its 2021 highs. So right now it's at 0.05914. If we put a price label, I can't even remember where these things are, but the top of that wedge is around 0.067. Around 0.067. You could argue there was a fake out right here. But we'll have to see. Honestly, I don't have a super strong opinion about this chart. Sol has already taken out its high on its ETH pair. So it's possible it continues to do so. It's also possible this is just a short-term deviation above the range high, just like these were short-term deviations below the range low. And it then therefore reverses course. But the counterpoint to that, and to be fair to Solana, right? To be fair to Solana, if you're going to measure Sol Bitcoin's market cap valuation, you got to do the same thing with ETH. And if you do that, and you look at the Sol market cap divided by the ETH market cap, Sol's already at new all-time highs against ETH. Right? Now, I mean, you could argue that it's trying to sort of break out of this, and it hasn't. But I also think that Ethereum's underperformance is going to be ending relatively soon. Meaning, doesn't mean it can't go down on its USD pair, but I think that ETH Bitcoin is going to bottom out potentially as early as September. And therefore, I think ETH's underperformance will end very, very soon. Which means that Sol's outperformance against ETH could end soon. Last cycle, in the year that the Fed cut rates, ETH Bitcoin bottomed the first week of September. And we are coming up on that next week. It might take it until December to bottom, but I think it will bottom between September and December at the latest. So if ETH's underperformance against Bitcoin ends soon, there's a chance that Sol's outperformance against ETH ends soon. So, to sort of summarize, I was right about Solana in 2022. I said it was going to go below $10, and it did. I did not pivot. The reason why was because I thought Bitcoin would collectively outperform the altcoin market, and I did not want to get in the business of trying to pick out which alts it was going to be. I will say that a lot of the people that have been the most critical of me as it relates to Solana were also very much promoting a lot of other altcoins that went to zero. You guys remember Luna, right? That was sort of fresh in everyone's mind over here. Luna had just gone to zero, and then Solana had a pretty big drop. You know, these are these stories from prior cycles that can get lost. But the emotions back over here were that Luna just went to zero. It actually went to zero. Who knew what was going to happen with all these other alts? I didn't know. Right? I certainly didn't know. But it's easy to, to sort of look back and say, well, this is the one that outperformed. And then you look back at so many others that so many people were bullish on, back then. Like Matic, right? Hasn't done anything. Even Chainlink, right? I mean, it really got a rally, but it's just faded back down. A lot of these, Polkadot, not a thing. Avalanche. These were also alts that a lot of people have been very bullish on last cycle. And, frankly, look at their chart. Yeah, they had a nice little rally, but they're giving a lot of it back, which is exactly what happened in the last cycle, right? Altcoins rallied. They rallied a lot. And then they gave it all back in the halving year. They gave it all back in the pre-halving year and then going into the halving year. They gave it back after right around the time that looser monetary policy arrived. A lot of those gains were given back. And so you have to wonder, is it just kind of doing the same thing, Alts are still struggling to break through here. I'm not saying they can't. They haven't broken through yet. So we'll see. We'll see. I tip my hat to Solana's outperformance against Bitcoin since 2023 began. I will remind people that there are actually other alts that went on to new all-time highs, and that was actually what I was talking about outperformance. This is still technically not a higher high. Doesn't mean that it can't turn into one, but it hasn't been there yet. If it follows sort of last cycle altcoins, some of the more optimistic, some of the altcoins last cycle that did very well in the QT rally, then if it were to follow through the entire way, then essentially what would happen is that there would be a sell-off and then there would be another rally after QE returns, if that were to play out. So those are my views on Solana. If there is no pullback on the USD pair and the Bitcoin pair, what you would want to see hold is the bull market support band. That ranges from 148 to 152. So if it can hold that, then fine. Maybe it can prove that other view wrong. But remember, ETH USD was also looking like that was holding as well back over here, and then it still eventually fell back into the wedge in 2019 as looser monetary policy arrived. Those are my views on Solana. I'm not really that excited about putting this video out because I do imagine it will elicit a lot of negative feedback from people on both sides. But the reality is that, you know, it's worth talking about. It's worth following the higher market cap alts so that we can understand better what the overall crypto market cap is doing. And I just want to make that view known. The only reason I'm expressing that view that I've expressed in this video is because I haven't seen it expressed anywhere else. All I see are the people that were bull posting about Solana here kept doing it over here and will say awful things to anyone who says anything different. But please be aware that this stuff can happen, right? If they mocked Bitcoin dominance in this rally, it's possible they're about to find out why Bitcoin dominance matters. And that's the reason I say a lot, look at all Bitcoin pairs. Historically, on average, they're oscillators at best. And last cycle, they broke down right as rate cuts arrived. As rate cuts arrived, all Bitcoin pairs broke down. My friends, rate cuts are about to arrive. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.